How many of you have ever used a navigation system of any kind? And with a show of hands, whether it's on your cell phone or your computer, a GPS, how many of you have ever used a navigation system? Yeah, I think all of us, if not most of us, have used some type of GPS system, to get from point A to point B when we're not sure how to get where we need to be. Well, it's very handy that on our smartphones that we have the navigation systems. Now, before the smartphone, there was something called MapQuest. How many of you remember MapQuest? Yeah, you're at least like 35 or over if you remember MapQuest. Now listen, millennials, if you're under like 30, here's what MapQuest was. You used to have to print up your directions on a printer before you left your house. And that's how you would figure out where to go. And if you've used MapQuest, I remember when MapQuest came out, that was like the best thing that ever happened to humanity. I mean, because the alternative before MapQuest was the Thomas Guide. How many of you have ever used a Thomas Guide before? Yeah, you're really aging yourself now. I remember my dad with the Thomas Guide, when he was trying to figure out where to go, and it was the most confusing book I've ever seen. You think the Bible's hard to understand. No, the Thomas Guide, all sorts of letters and numbers and cross-referencing and pages. If you know how to use the Thomas Guide, you should be able to navigate the Bible so easily. Because the Thomas Guide, well, it's difficult. But thankfully now, we have GPS on our phone. We have a navigation system to help us to get to where we need to be when we don't know how to get there. Now, my wife and I, we use on our smartphones the Maps app on our iPhones. We like that. Some people like Waze. Listen, I'm not trying to get in an argument with you about it. Some have Google Maps. It doesn't matter. As long as you use Nav, you can get to where you need to be. But my wife has on her phone this nice little lady that will give her step-by-step vocal directions of where she's supposed to go. So in addition to the navigation system, she has this lady that says, in 75 feet, turn right. In 50 feet, turn right. In 25 feet, turn right. In 10 feet, turn right. You just missed your right turn. Please advance the next 6 miles forward. She loves the lady. My wife and this lady have a great relationship, and they get along great. That lady and I, not my wife, the other lady on my phone, we don't get along so well. She's always lagging behind, and so I muted her, because as a man, you never need a lady to tell you how to get to where you need to go. No, I'm kidding. Calm down. But really, my wife, she has this lady to tell her where she needs to go. Now, wouldn't it be nice when it comes to trying to figure out where you are going in your life, how to navigate the uncertain times that you're facing, maybe some unexpected detours in your life? Wouldn't it be nice if you had a navigation system where you could just ask your navigation life system where you should go? Like you could just have a GPS coordinates of your life, and you would just say something like, write it in and be like, what am I supposed to do with my life? And it would just say,
I want you to pastor Regenerate Church, be a husband, a father, and the best Bible teacher in the world.
Okay, God, thank you. That makes it super clear. Yeah. Okay. If that's what you want me to do, God, then I'll do it, And I remember when, I was single and praying about, Lord, is really Morgan the right one? Or should I marry her? Who is it that you have for me? Is there someone that you have for me? And God, what is it that you want me to do? And when it comes to this relationship, and wouldn't it be nice if you could just write that in real quick? God, who should I marry?
Isn't it obvious? I want you to marry the beautiful, foxy brunette woman named Morgan. You better do it fast before she moves on without you. Plus, she is the only one you can find that will love you.
That's true, Lord. That's true. Okay, God, if that's what you want me to do, then I'll do it. Or God, where do you want me to go in my life? Like, God, how do I get to where you want me to be? And you could just, God, where is it that you want me to be in my life?
Sure. I will give you step-by-step directions. P.S. I love what you are doing at Regenerate Church. Best church ever.
Thanks, God. All right, if that's what you want me to do, God, then I'll do it. Wouldn't that be nice, if we just had those coordinates, the GPS of God's guidance? It could just make it super simple, super clear. This is what I want you to do, and okay, God, then I'll do it. But as it relates to receiving our GPS, God's perfect sign, our coordinates, when it comes to God's perfect sign, it's actually not God's perfect sign, it's God's perfect Son. Jesus would declare to his disciples when he would tell them, I'm about to go somewhere that you can't follow, as talking about his ascension to heaven after his death. And he said, but you know the way. But then the disciples speak up and they say, but God, we don't know the way. We don't know how to get there. And Jesus responds to them and says, don't you understand? I am the way. You see, it's more than Jesus giving information to you on the steps that he wants you to take. It's about who he will be for you. A relationship with God that he promises to walk with us step by step throughout our lives, our journey through life with Jesus. But there's times in our lives that it can be completely difficult. How do I navigate this situation? How do I get to the place that God has for me to be in? How will we know the direction to go day by day by day? Especially when it comes to the difficulties we don't know how to get through. Perhaps it's a loss of a loved one. Maybe your spouse unexpectedly, you find out, has cancer and you don't know how you're going to navigate this. Maybe a life was lost unexpectedly and you don't know how you're going to be able to get through this. And the uncertainties in which we don't know what to do, and we just, God, what do you want me to do? It's easy in times like that to lose our sense of direction, and we don't know how to navigate the situations. Maybe when you're served a divorce paper unexpectedly, or when your child tells you they're confused about their orientation, or when you lose that job that you've had for 35 years and were planning on retiring the very next year, and you had your life planned out and it was all good to go, and then something unexpected happens and it turns your life upside down. Or maybe when a family member decides to no longer walk with the Lord, who once walked so strongly with the Lord. And you're trying to figure out what to do. How do I reach this person? God, how am I going to navigate this? But in this series, we are discovering God's divine direction for our lives. How God will lead us day by day by day. And my hope for each one of us today is that we would truly have an understanding and be able to grasp how God will guide us for our own lives personally, practically, how God gets us to where he wants us to be each and every day. We pick up in our text in Exodus chapter 13. God had a plan to deliver his people out of Egypt to the promised land, the land that God had reserved for his people. And after over 400 years of being in Egypt, God raises up Moses to deliver his people out of Egypt. God brought about 10 plagues so that the people of Egypt would know the power of God, and the people of Israel would know that God has the power to save. They would know that God is the one true God and God has the power to save. And so God would exemplify his power to lead his people out of Egypt. After those 10 plagues, Pharaoh says, you're out of here. You have to go. Leave us. And now the Israelites all together exodus from Egypt, and now they are making their way towards the promised land. And I want us to see today how God is faithful to get them to where he wants them to be. We pick up in Exodus chapter 13, verse 17. It says, when Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through the Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them, underline this, in a roundabout way through the wilderness towards the Red Sea. Thus the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. Now I want us to understand today, before you can face the impossible situation, God needs to prepare you for the impossible. Before you can face what God has for you in your future, God has to teach you along the way, because God prepares his vessel. And so you have to realize, as people are leaving Egypt, picture the map in your mind's eye. Egypt over here, the promised land a little bit northeast of Egypt, along the Mediterranean. Now God leads them out of Egypt and then tells them to go south. Why? Because if they do the direct route to the promised land, well, that's all Philistine territory, and God knows the feebleness of his people. If they have to go into battle as soon as they get out of Egypt, they're just going to walk right back into slavery in Egypt after all that God has done. And so he knew they weren't ready yet. They needed to see God's hand with them that much more. And so God tells them to do a roundabout, to head south. Now, as they head south, you have to understand this, that south formation of land is like a V formation. There's two gulfs that come off the ocean, and those two gulfs completely surround like two lines of a V around that land. So as they start heading down into this land formation surrounded by two gulfs, they're completely surrounded by water on both sides, and they keep going further and further and further down into this dead end. God is leading them what seemingly is into a dead end, but God has a pathway for them to walk that they don't even understand would be a possibility. This was not a direct route. You ever have your GPS take you on an indirect route? Anybody ever plug their GPS coordinates on their phone and it goes like 5 lefts? And you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't even make sense. If I keep turning left, I'm just going in a circle. Or have you ever had your GPS coordinates? Anybody ever take you like 3 off-ramps further than you had to go? And it tells you to get back on the freeway and go the other way. You're like, why didn't you just tell me to get off and go the most direct route? Now what I love in the updates now is it gives you like 3 options. You know, you can take this route or this route or this route, and it will offer you the most direct route. And I love that because I'm always in a hurry. I don't know why, but I'm always in a hurry. And I just want to get there where I need to be as fast as I possibly can. But God doesn't work that way. God doesn't take you on the most direct route in life. God, just get me to where I need to be. No, because sometimes you can get to where you need to be before you're ready to be there. And God hasn't yet taught you the lessons in your life that you need to know. And the important life lessons that needs to be life transforming for you before you get there. The worst thing that can happen in your life is if you step into all that God has for you and you're not ready for it yet. Why? Because you'll just mess it up. You won't be ready for what God has for you and you'll ruin his plans. And so God will sometimes take us on some detours in life, the unexpected circumstances, to prepare us, to strengthen us, to solidify us in our faith in him and who we are in Jesus. So now we have to understand, write this down, there is a reason for the roundabouts. There is a reason for the roundabout. Now, none of us like being on roundabouts. You know, roundabouts is something that they have in like the UK and Europe, you know, those roundabouts. Some people are trying to get fancy with the roads here in Southern California, and they're starting to put roundabouts in these newer communities. And you know, if you get stuck on a roundabout, here's what happens. You just go in circles over and over and over and over again. We don't want to stay on a roundabout very long, do we? We don't like the roundabout because we're not getting anywhere. I want to get to where I need to be, and so no one wants to stay on that roundabout. Each location, though, that God would take his people on in this roundabout would be preparation for what ultimately God would be planning to do in their future. Now, you might feel like in life, you're just going in circles. I'm not really getting anywhere. In my career field, in my calling, in my ministry. I don't really see that I'm making any progress. And it doesn't seem like I'm any further ahead than I was last year or the year before that or the last decade. It seems like I'm in the same place for the last 10 years. I'm not doing anything different than I was doing 10 years ago. But what you have to understand today is that God is preparing you for your future. Well, God is preparing your future for you. God is using what you are going through presently to solidify you and strengthen you and ready you for what he wants to do in your life next. And I can tell you firsthand, it is frustrating to be on the roundabout, going in circles and feeling like you're not getting anywhere and things aren't progressing in the way that you thought they would. That can be frustrating. But I'll tell you this, God will allow you to be on the roundabout as long as you need to be until he accomplishes the work that he wants to accomplish within your life. And he'll use that in your life to develop you and prepare you for what he has for you next. The most important place that we need to be is exactly wherever God wants us to be. And then it goes on to say in verse 19 of chapter 13, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear to do this. He said, God will certainly come to help you, and when he does, you must take my bones with you from this place. The Israelites left Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. Now they're going further down. So first they're at Succoth, and now they're going down to Etham, which is halfway down into that V formation of land. They're going further into the corner, further into what seems to be a dead end. And it seemingly doesn't make sense to go down further because the promised land's up here, and they're going in the opposite direction of where you need to go to get to the promised land. But God takes them further down. They're going deeper into this alcove. And then it says in verse 21, the Lord went ahead of them. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud, and he provided light at night with a pillar of fire. This allowed them to travel by day or by night, and the Lord did not remove the pillar of cloud or pillar of fire from its place in front of the people. Now, when facing an impossible situation, we have to realize God's way is always going to be the right way. It might not make sense to us. It can be frustrating to us to be on that roundabout. It can be frustrating to us to see that my life is changing in a way that I didn't expect for it to change. Frankly, in a way that I didn't want it to change. And that can be frustrating, but we have to understand today that God's way will always be the best way. And so we see God give them this super cool GPS system. A cloud by day that would be in front of them and a pillar of fire at night that would go before them. So they could follow God's perfect sign. Talk about God's perfect sign, GPS. It was a cloud and a pillar of fire. Just follow the sign and God will get you to where you need to be. And you gotta love God when he does this because Moses is a man and men have a hard time stopping and asking for directions. And so God's like, you know what, Moses, I'm going to make it super simple for you. I know you don't want to ask for directions, so here's your road sign. Just follow it, and you'll get to where you need to be. Now, what I want us to see, though, because this applies to our lives personally today, watch how God guided them by this cloud. It doesn't tell us here, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1, talking about the Exodus that we are studying right now in the book of Exodus, it says, I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. All of them were guided by a cloud that moved ahead of them. That's the NLT. It pictures that cloud going in front of them, and then they would have to follow that cloud as if that cloud would be a far distance away. And for some reason in my mind, that's how I always pictured it. That cloud, a couple miles ahead of them, and they just have to follow it as the cloud would move ahead of them. But 1 Corinthians 10 verse 1 in the New King James Version, look how it puts it. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud. So the NLT translation says the cloud would move ahead of them, but the New King James translation says the cloud would be above them. Well, that's a big discrepancy. Which one is it? It's not a big discrepancy because it's both. the cloud would begin to move ahead of them as the cloud would be above them. And as the cloud would move in front of them, ahead of them, well, they would just be under the shade of that cloud. You see, in the wilderness, temperatures could reach up to 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot, blistering sun. And it would be a whole lot cooler in the shade of the cloud covering that God had given to them. And so what would happen is the cloud would move ahead of them, and then they would realize they're not in the shade anymore, so they would just kind of scoot over and get in the shade again. And then the cloud would move ahead of them, and then they would realize we need to stay in the shade. And they would kind of just move wherever the cloud would go. They would go where the cloud would guide them. So the cloud was moving ahead of them, but also would be over them. You see, Psalms 105, the psalmist declaring about this story again in verse 39 says, "The Lord spread a cloud above them as a covering and gave them a great fire to light the darkness." You see, they were under the cloud, and when the cloud moved, they moved. Why would they stay under the cloud? I'll tell you why, because it's the same way that God guides us today. They had it made in the shade. You see, it was cooler in the shade. And so when it comes to God guiding you, let me ask you this. What's cool for you? Now, I want to make sure you understand this because the Bible declares that God will give us the desires of our hearts, but only when we are delighting ourselves in Him. It says, delight yourself in Him, and then He will give you the desires of your heart. Why? Because He can't give us the desires of our heart if we're not delighting ourselves in Him. Because our hearts are deceitfully wicked, the Bible says, who can know it? Our hearts are really, really messed up, jacked up, horrible. That's just our hearts. But when we delight ourselves in God, He begins to transform our hearts. No longer our will, but God's will. You see, Jeremiah 29 talks about the new covenant. The new covenant that would be implemented one day after Jesus, as Jesus would establish this new covenant. And Jeremiah says, prophetically speaking, it says the new covenant is that God, speaking through Jeremiah, I will write the tablets, or I will write my will on the tablets of your heart. The new covenant is this, the relationship that we have with Jesus is that He takes His will, the best plan for our lives, and He embosses that upon our hearts so that we know what His will is, but it's our heart. We desire to do His will because He places His will within our hearts. So as long as we delight ourselves in Him, we can follow our hearts, but be careful because if you're following your heart and your focus is not to honor the Lord, love the Lord, please the Lord, live for the Lord, well, your heart will lead you astray. St. Augustine was once asked by his students, how can we really know God's will for our lives? And St. Augustine said, love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and then do whatever you want. You see, they had it made in the shade. We often think about God's plan for our lives. I don't know if I can surrender my life to God's plan, because maybe God's gonna, take me to the Amazon, and the mosquitoes there are like 3 feet big, and I don't really want to deal with mosquitoes. And you know what? I don't really feel called to marrying Amazonian women. I know they don't shave their legs, and that's not for me. So, maybe that's, I don't know if I want to follow God's plan for my life. But you have to understand, whatever God's plan is for you, you will want to do. You'll have that desire within your heart because God's plan is best and He'll write His will for your life within your heart as long as you delight yourself in Him. So you seek the Lord with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. And then do what the Lord places in your heart to do. That's how God guides us. But notice this, it wasn't only a cloud by day, it was also a pillar of fire by night. There's a second way that God guides us because fire in the Bible is always a symbol of or a picture of trials, tribulations, difficulty. And sometimes, things will be really cool and I love to do that. I'm just going to do that because it's God's will and He places it on your heart. Oftentimes, though, God doesn't use a cloud. He'll also use fire. difficulty in our lives. And we think of this difficulty as this is horrible, this is bad. How can this be happening to me? I don't deserve this, but God will be using the fire in your life to get you to where you need to be. Maybe you've recently found yourself unemployed, and I have a friend who was a fireman and recently found himself discharged from his duties because of certain stances he would take for his own life. And because of that, he was let go, and shortly before he would receive his benefits and his retirement. And he felt so frustrated about that. And we begin to talk about this, but listen, you have to understand that God will use the fire to get you to where he wants you to be. So God can guide you by a cloud. That's cool. That's great. We love the cloud. But the fire, no. No way, Jose. No, I don't want the fire, but God will use both equally to get us to where he wants us to be. The fires, the trials, the difficulties can guide us in the same way, and we have to understand that when we go through difficulty, God wastes nothing. God will not allow that difficulty to go to waste in your life. But God will use that ultimately to get you to where he wants you to be. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, verse 30, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." The place that God has for you to be, the place that God is leading you to be, it's going to be what's best for you. God's plan, his will always be what's best for you. And he'll be faithful to get you there one way or another. Now, I want to give you 3 things to hold on today as a reminder that God will be faithful to get you to where he wants you to be. Number 1, write this down. God goes before you. God goes before you. Look at verse 21 again. It says, the Lord went ahead of them. And verse 22, he did not remove the cloud of fire from in front of them. God would go before them, paving the pathway, the road that he would have for them to walk on. God was before them, leading them. God has your future mapped out. You don't need MapQuest. You don't even need GPS, because God has your plan for your life that's very best already all mapped out for you. All you have to do is follow his direction. Step by step, day by day, obediently, following him with your life, and then God will get you to where he wants you to be. Moses, knowing this and seeing God do this in his own life, tells his successor Joshua, when Joshua is being commissioned into the leadership of these people, Moses would say in Deuteronomy 31, verse 7, as all of the Israel was watching, he said to him, be strong and courageous, for you will lead these people into the land the Lord swore to their ancestors he would give them. You are the one who will divide it among their grants of land. Do not be afraid or discouraged. Watch this. For the Lord will personally go ahead of you, and he will be with you. He will neither fail you nor abandon you. God would be leading them. And Moses spoke from personal experience when he commissioned Joshua. God is going to go before you. He's going to win the battles already ahead of you. All you have to do is follow him. Moses could say that with certainty because he lived it personally. Moses lived it, but look where God was taking Moses, into a corner. Now, militarily, that would be really not strategic in placing what we found out last week to be probably around 3 million people, because you would have nowhere to retreat. You would have nowhere to escape to. You would be cornered in, and sometimes we feel like you're in a corner. I'm cornered. I have no way out. I'm stuck. I'm stuck in this place. I'm stuck in the same place year after year after year, and I've been trying to move it forward, and now I'm stuck. And so Moses, in this corner, decides, well, maybe I need to move. Maybe I need to go somewhere else. Maybe we should start heading back up to the promised land. And so when Moses hits Pi-hahiroth, which is at the very bottom, in the very corner, the furthest he could really get away from the promised land in that landmass that he was in that alcove, as he's there, he starts to head back up towards the promised land. And God tells him, stop, to go back in the opposite direction and go back to Pi-hahiroth. First they are at Succoth, then Etham, then Pi-hahiroth. And that sometimes is similar, I feel like, to the path that God has had our church on. We started at the Oasis Senior Center a little over 10 years ago in Corona Del Mar. Then we outgrew that first room and we moved into a bigger room there. And then from there, we started our Sunday morning services at the Triangle movie theaters. And we launched our Sunday morning church service there third Sunday in August 2011. And you know what? Sometimes we felt like we were in the corner. Why? Because our movie theater was actually in the corner. And you know what we called our kids ministry at that time before it was known as Our Kids? It was the kids corner. And the reason why it was the kids corner is because all we had was a corner. We had like an alcove in the hallway that we turned into the kids ministry. So we called it the kids corner because that's all it really was. It was just a corner. And we're like, you know what? We're stuck in this corner. But then God opened a door for us to move as a church. And we moved into a church facility that we were there for 4 years. And then God moved us again. And he moved us from there to this location on our current campus that we're on. And sometimes it feels like, you know what? We're moving further away from where we desire to be and where God wants us to be, you know, in our own facility and those things. And we can often wonder, God, where are you taking us? This doesn't make sense. Where are we going? I've been praying that very prayer. And then God gave me Exodus 13 and 14. And God said, I am going before you. I am paving a pathway for this church, for you all to walk. And you might feel like you don't know where you are going, but God has a plan for the path that we are to walk. And when you see what God is going to do, not even an option that you could have ever planned or thought through would be the doors that God will be opened to you. Because you know the story of what God is about to do. In Exodus chapter 14, look at verse 1. Then the Lord gave these instructions to Moses. Order the Israelites to turn back and camp by Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. Camp there along the shore across from Baal-zephon. Then Pharaoh will think the Israelites are confused. They are trapped in the wilderness. And once again, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will chase after you. I have planned this in order to display my glory through Pharaoh and his whole army. After this, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites camped there as they were told. So Moses, he starts to make his way back up to the promised land out of that corner. And God says, no. What are you doing? Go back to the corner. Go put your backs up against the sea. And Moses could think, this doesn't make any sense. Why am I doing this? This is where we need to go, God. This is where we need to get to be. And God says, no, I'm going to do something greater than you could have ever thought or expected or anticipated. Moses, camp out at Pi-hahiroth. And he says, for I have planned this. It's all part of God's plan. And he says, I am doing this in order to display my glory. When people see what I'm about to do, it's going to cause them to praise me, and I'm going to get the glory. And then God says, after this, after what? After I intervene and do my plan and open the door that I'm going to open, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. Egypt is a type of what, church? Yes, you got it. Egypt is a type of the world. And when God does what only God can do through our church and through our lives and through our ministries and through our homes, when God does what only God can do, the world will see who God is. That's God's desire, to reveal himself through us to the world. And so the Israelites camped where they were told. Notice that God's people just simply continued to do, although it didn't make sense to them, they continued to do what God told them to do. God goes before us, and whenever God has a plan, listen, the enemy's always going to want to come against it. Watch this, what happens in verse 5. It says, when word reached the king of Egypt that the Israelites had fled Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds, what have we done letting all those Israelite slaves get away, they asked. So Pharaoh harnessed his chariot and called up his troops. He took with him 600 of Egypt's best chariots, along with the rest of the chariots of Egypt, each with its commander. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So he chased after the people of Israel, who had left with fists raised in defiance. The Egyptians chased after them with all the forces in Pharaoh's army, all his horses and chariots, his charioteers and his troops. The Egyptians caught up with the people of Israel as they were camped beside the shore near Pihahiroth, across from Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up and panicked when they saw the Egyptians overtaking them. They cried out to the Lord and they said to Moses, "Why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness?" In other words, wah! Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave Egypt? Didn't we tell you this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness. Now, the people of Israel are where God wants them to be, but what do? They start complaining. Why? Because the enemy started coming against them. We have to be careful that when we are doing what God calls us to do, and the enemy comes with opposition to attack us, we don't complain because we don't yet see what God is going to do. And so it goes on to say in verse 13, but Moses told the people, don't be afraid, just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. Maybe that's a word for some of us today. Just stop trying to figure it out. Just stand still and watch. Be amazed about what God is going to do. The Egyptians you see today will never be seen again. The Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm. In other words, take a chill pill. Just relax. Breathe through your nose. Just chill out. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to get moving. Interesting. They complain to Moses, so Moses turns and starts crying out to God. God, why? And God goes, just tell the people to get up and start doing something. Just to get moving in what I've called them to do. Pick up your staff and raise your hand over the sea. Divide the water so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they will charge after the Israelites. My great glory will be displayed through Pharaoh and his troops, his chariots and his charioteers. And when my glory is displayed through them, all Egypt will see my glory and know that I am the Lord. Then the angel of God who had been leading the people of Israel moved to the rear of the camp. Notice that. The pillar of cloud also moved from the front and stood behind them. God goes before you, but we see in our text today that God is also behind you. That God is behind you. In other words, listen, God not only goes in front of you, paving the pathway for you to walk, but God still got your back. God's watching out for you when the enemy wants to overtake you and take you down, that God is protecting you and watching over you. And the enemy, when he comes after you, God has your back. I remember growing up, I had two big brothers, and I was the little child. Growing up, I was always the little one. Both my brothers are like behemoth-sized humans and Viking-sized people. And, one's almost 6'6", one's almost 6'4", and they're both all-American athletes. And then there was me not hitting puberty until I was like 31. And so growing up, my mom and dad thought of me as like the little child. But that didn't stop me from getting into some trouble because we all played basketball together. And so we would be playing pickup games at different courts and stuff. And, I would mess with people because I had to learn if I couldn't out-tough somebody, then I would outsmart somebody. And I would use that on the basketball court. And so, I'd throw the ball through some people's legs and cross them over, make them fall over, then stop and kind of laugh at them. And, it wasn't very Christian-like, and I repented of that. But I still did it as part of my past. Praise the Lord, it's my testimony. So in doing so, a lot of times people wouldn't fight me because I was a little guy and I was making fun of them. And so sometimes people would try to fight me, but I wasn't afraid of them ever. Because what they didn't know is my two huge brothers were also on my team. And so they would always get my back. So when someone would want to mess with me, my brothers would jump in and I would just kind of smile and be like, it's not my fight. I don't have to fight this fight. You have to deal with them. You got to come through them before you can get to me. And so growing up, that emboldens you when you realize who's got your back. And sometimes in a wrongful way, it can embolden you to do something stupid like I was doing on the basketball court often. But my point is this: when you realize that God has your back, it will embolden you to do what God has called you to do. You don't have to worry about the enemy coming after you or what people might think of you when you do what God's called you to do, because God has your back. God is behind you. So here's what you are supposed to do. Here's where you're supposed to go. Look at verse 20. It says in verse 20, the cloud settled between the Egyptians and the Israelite camps. As darkness fell, the cloud turned into fire, lighting up the night. But the Egyptians and Israelites did not approach each other all night. That pillar of fire separated them. Then Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all that night, turning the seabed into dry land. So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground with walls of water on each side. Now there's some people that speculate where they actually crossed over the Red Sea. And I guess there's this area, not near Pi-Hahiroth, but there's this area where the water could get really, really shallow. And if there was a low tide, then there would only be about maybe 6 inches of water and maybe some dry spots for them to walk across on. And so people try to explain scientifically how it's just through natural phenomenon of the environment, how the people were able to cross over. You know, that wasn't God doing a miracle. Yeah, it did historically happen that way. They can't deny that. But it wasn't a miracle. There is no God. Really? Because that's amazing. And if people want to believe that, that's okay with me. And the reason why is because God will now drown the entire army of Egypt in the water. And if they drown in 6 inches of water, that's even a greater miracle than parting the Red Sea. And so people try to explain away the miraculous signs that God does. But this truly was a miracle that God did, parting the Red Sea. Listen, they didn't have a pathway to walk. They didn't know how God was going to get them there, but God does the miraculous. God opens up doors that no man can close. And so it goes on to say in verse 23, then the Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and charioteers chased them into the middle of the sea. But just before dawn, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian army from the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw their forces into total confusion. He twisted their chariot wheels, making their chariots difficult to drive. Let's get out of here, away from these Israelites, the Egyptians shouted. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. And when all the Israelites had reached the other side, the Lord said to Moses, raise your hand over the sea again. Then the waters will rush back and cover the Egyptians and their chariots and charioteers. So as the sun began to rise, Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the water rushed back into its usual place. The Egyptians tried to escape, but the Lord swept them into the sea. Then the waters returned and covered all the chariots and charioteers. The entire army of Pharaoh, of all the Egyptians who had chased the Israelites into the sea, not a single one survived. But the people of Israel had walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, as the water stood up like a wall on both sides. That is how the Lord rescued Israel from the hand of the Egyptians that day. And the Israelites saw the bodies of the Egyptians washed up on the seashore. When the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. They put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. God goes before you, paving a pathway for you to walk. God is behind you, getting your back. But there's one more thing I want you to see before we leave here today. Number 3, God is by you. God is not only before you and behind you, but God is by you. Notice this back in chapter 13. There it says in verse 20, the Israelites left Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. In other words, that's like the edge of the world. There's nothing out there but nothing. But the word Etham means this. Etham simply is translated with them. God was with them even when they were on the brink of nothing. when there was nothing going on, nothing happening, nothing to see, nothing further out there, God was still with them, reminding them, I know it looks like nothing good can come of this. I know it looks like nothing good is happening in your life presently, but I am still with you, and I will be faithful to get you to where you need to be, because I can part the Red Sea. I can do what no man can do, and I will get you there. Aren't you thankful for the guidance of God in your life today? Later, when Moses was commissioning Joshua, he would say to him in Joshua 1:9, again, the Lord God is with you wherever you go. The Lord not only goes before you, the Lord is not only behind you, but the Lord will be by you. Wherever you go, know this, it's where the Lord is leading you. Wherever you're at, the Lord will be with you. The psalmist would declare, even if I ascend into heaven, you are there. Even if I descend into Sheol, you are still there. There's nowhere where I can escape from your presence. There's nowhere where I can go where you're not. Jonah found that to be true in his own life when he thought he could run from the presence of God, and he found out the hard way. What happens when you go on a pathway that God isn't leading you on, and you go in the opposite direction of what God has called you to do? Well, you find yourself in the depths of the ocean, the depths of despair, in the deep blue, as he was swallowed by a whale and taken down into the depths. You always find yourself in the pits. You always find yourself just being eaten from the inside out, as Jonah would be, being dissolved by that fish's digestive enzymes as he was in that belly of that great fish. That's why it's so important that we follow the Lord. Even when you don't know how it's going to work out, or even when you don't know what God is doing, as long as you are with God, staying by God, staying close to God, God will get you to where he wants you to be. You follow God's guidance, and he's going to open up the pathway for you to walk. You follow God's guidance, and even if it doesn't make sense to you, God will provide a way of escape when you thought there was no other way. And you look to where God guides us. And all you have to do is listen to his word, and then you will see the miraculous in your life too. Follow God's guidance, his divine direction. He guides us by the cloud. Oh, this is cool. He guides us by the fire. Oh, this is hard. But we know that God will be going before us. He's got our backs. He's behind us, and he will always be by us. Stay close to him, and God will get you to where you need to be too.